So who here has heard of Bitcoin? Hands up. How many people would say they know what it is? Fewer. How many people just heard about it in a newspaper? Yeah, or TV, or in the media. Okay, so most people have heard about it from sources other than the media. That's good. Do you know how to? Okay, thanks. Okay, great. So actually, I'm not even going to talk much about Bitcoin today, because Bitcoin sort of exists, and it's sort of the now, and it's growing very quickly, and that's great. But I was asked to talk about the future of money, and I'm going to be incredibly arrogant. I'm actually not only going to talk about the future of money, I'm going to talk about the future like 50 years from now, possibly, and make some predictions so you can all laugh at me when I'm an old retired guy. Oh, awesome. Is there even a clicker? No, I'll duck. It's okay. No, that's no problem. Great. So let's start off talking about the future with the present. What about now? Just very briefly. So we live in a time of many crises, right? There seems to be financial crises all the time. There was one in 2008, there was one in 2001, there was an Asian financial crisis before that, there's going to be more coming. That's bad. Coming up, for example, pensions crisis. Pension funds are largely, or many of them are actually insolvent at the moment, and it doesn't look like they're going to be able to catch up. So that's a problem. Also coming up, sovereign independence crisis. You probably haven't heard about this one yet. In 2010, the US government passed a law that effectively takes control of every financial institution in the world. For this, it has a very interesting recursive withholding tax structure. What that means is if you run a bank or other institution, even if you don't have any trade with the United States or any assets there, you still have to comply with US law, even if that conflicts with local law. And most people haven't realized this yet because it's still being implemented. The banks have to upgrade all their IT systems to track who's compliant and stuff. Sorry. And that's not done yet. When this is done, people are going to be very unhappy about that, of course. Goes without saying. But I don't want to talk about all that because it's too depressing. And I want to talk about the future, and I think it's important when we think about the future to be optimistic and just generally be as optimistic as possible, because the future could be a really great time for all of us if we try and get things right. So this is my only slide about Bitcoin. I'm actually not going to tell you much about how it works or anything like that. So if you want to learn more, feel free to ask me afterwards or just visit our website. I would say it's actually a solution to all those problems, which might sound rather ambitious, and maybe you can't see how it is. But I think it is. Bitcoin, for those who aren't totally sure what it is, it's essentially a way of having finance with no intermediaries at all. So today finance means banks, it means companies like Visa and MasterCard, it might mean PayPal, Square on top. That's 3 layers of intermediaries right there. And Bitcoin is all about doing it with no intermediaries at all. It's made possible by some very recent advances in computer science, specifically the science of how to synchronize databases when faced with malicious adversaries. But I'm not going to talk any about computer science today. Economically, it has this interesting structure where the inflation is limited and predictable because on top of this computer science innovation, it creates a new currency that's like a foreign currency. It's like the euro or the dollar. It floats against others. But I'm not going to talk about that either. There's no political interference, which is obviously great if you're worried about sovereign independence. But the thing I'm really going to talk about today is the innovations that it enables, because I'm a technologist at heart, I'm a computer programmer, and I really love thinking about technology and the future of technology. So now you know what I'm not going to talk about. What I am going to talk about is I'm going to imagine a world 50 years from now, which is a height of arrogance, and I won't disagree with that. And I'm going to imagine how it's impacted by technologies that exist today, but which are very young or in the lab, and which are not quite brought to market yet. So this is the real start of my talk. My name is Mike, and I love the future. And when I was growing up in the 80s, I used to go down to the local library and I would dig out books that were full of pictures like this, and I'm sure you've seen them. They were drawn in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and they were kind of drawn in a time of utopian idealism when people imagined the future, and this is what they imagined, like flying cars, and houses on the beach, and meal pills, and robots that talk to you, and all this good stuff. And I just loved that stuff, I just lapped it up. And it never came true. Well, not all of it came true. We don't have flying cars, and I don't think we will in 50 years either. But one thing we will have is self-driving cars. And I know this because I work for Google. That's my spare time stuff. And we're already developing this and they work already. So this is not a particularly wild belief. This here, let's call this girl Jen. She's a wee Scottish lass, let's say, just because I'm going to tell you stories about the future and it needs a character. And Jen wants to join her friends in the city, right? So no one owns their own car in the future because why would you? That's expensive and troublesome. Instead, when you want to go somewhere, you summon a taxi and it comes and picks you up and drops you off, and then it drives off and picks someone else up and so on. You could do it today, but it's too expensive. But in the future, cars drive themselves, so it's not too expensive. And today, if you want a taxi ride, probably what you do is you phone up a taxi company, probably the one you used last time, or you find one in a directory or whatever, and you interact with them directly. You go to the business. But when Jen does this, what actually happens is she finds a ride via the trade net. And this is an experimental concept. The trade net is itself a peer-to-peer network. It's public infrastructure like email or the web or like Bitcoin. And it inverts commerce. So on the trade net, what happens is Jen says to her computer, she says, I'm here, I want to go into the city. And it goes out onto this network and it posts a request for bid. And the message that is posted says, here I am, here's where I want to go, give me your best offer. And all the different taxis out there, they actually start submitting offers. They say, I can do it for this price, I can do it for that price. Behind the scenes, Jen's computer looks at what's available and it figures out what the best offer really is. And it looks at things like, so it's a standardized broadcast and advert mechanism, basically. You don't really use it directly. Your smartphone does it behind the scenes, for example. Things that might be taken into consideration: did you use this provider before? Is the price completely unreasonable? Anonymized recommendations. So today, if business recommendations, it's all about social, and there's very little evidence this actually makes sense, because normally what you see are like names and photos of strangers, and their reviews don't mean anything to you. Or maybe if you're really lucky, you see a random person who you met once. Or you might get a friend, and that's relevant. But mostly you want to know about a business and no one you know personally has used it. But if you don't have the social element, then what you get is spam and businesses reviewing themselves, and it's really shady, right? I've seen what we have to do to de-spam Google Maps, and it's really bad. So this is the kind of thing that cryptography is really good at, and I think we'll easily have this nailed, like 50 years from now. That's not going to be an issue. And then there's all kinds of personalization involved here, machine learning models, and so on. And the trade net is not intended for all commerce, I should say, right? It's intended for things that are fast and lightweight and basically commoditized, where you know what you're going to get, pretty much. So taxi rides, fruit and vegetables, units of computation time, if you're buying cloud services, for example, all kinds of stuff. As an example of one thing that you might not be expecting, right? So as Jen gets driven into the city by this self-driving car, the car is itself doing trading on the trade net. And what it does is it goes out and it locates the roads that it is driving on, which are also economic actors, and it starts requesting road space on like a second-by-second basis. And the different roads that are out there actually submit bids and say how much they're going to charge to use them, depending on their current load, their capacity. So what Jen can do, if she wants, if she's in a hurry, she can bid more. And her car will pull into the fast lane because she outbid the other people on the road. Right? So this is a kind of very fast, lightweight economic interaction that doesn't happen today because our financial systems aren't efficient enough to a large extent. Now, this is all well and good, but there's an interesting question that we haven't asked, which is, who owns this vehicle exactly? Is it a taxi company? Is it Google, because they invented the self-driving cars, or they developed them? Is it the General Motors and Ford? Actually, the answer is a little bit unintuitive because we're asking the wrong question. The question we should be asking is, what owns this vehicle? Any ideas? The trade net? No. Actually, nothing owns this vehicle. Actually, the vehicle owns itself. Now, this is an idea we call an autonomous agent. An autonomous agent is effectively a computer that owns itself. That is, it pays for its own costs, it sells its own services on the trade net for money, And they can be pure hardware or software. So the first agents would probably be software, programs on the internet that exist just on the internet. But I'm going to talk about hardware because it's easier to visualize. And they take part in the trade net as first-class economic actors just alongside humans. And this is possible because of Bitcoin. Now, I've never tried. Maybe Jim could tell me what would happen if I did, but I suspect if I go to a bank and try and open a bank account that is owned by a computer program, they'll tell me to get lost, right? Or they'll think I'm crazy and report me to the police. But Bitcoin has no intermediaries, therefore there's really nothing to stop a computer just connecting to the internet and taking part all by itself. All you need to do to instantiate a Bitcoin wallet is generate a large random number. And pretty much anything can do that. So these devices, they actually earn money and they pay their own costs. And this makes them really the first form of artificial life truly worthy of the name. And I should stress at this point, these are not artificial intelligences, right? Everything in this talk is based on designs that could exist today. So it doesn't involve any sci-fi, right? They're not intelligent, they're just programs. So if they're economic actors, that implies they can make a profit, does it not? So what do they do with this profit? Well, just like people, if they do well economically, they have children. And what this means, and the children grow up and compete against the parents. And what this means is that they, for example, in the self-driving car case, what it does is it goes back onto the trade net and it says, I want to buy a new car. One is manufactured and it rolls off the production line. And the parent installs a copy of itself into the child. And the child starts with a birth loan, and then after it successfully pays off its birth loan, it goes and becomes independent and is competing against the parent. Now, if these things can make, I didn't invent this idea, by the way, I'm just telling you about it. If these things can make a profit, they can also make a loss. And what happens if they keep losing money? Well, just like any business, they die, actually. They can no longer pay their own costs, they can't recharge their batteries, and they die. Now, most likely, a smart agent is a well-programmed agent. It wouldn't really allow itself to die. What it would do is it would find somewhere to park in a long-term car park and go to sleep and then wake up after 6 months, see if economic conditions have improved a bit. If there's not enough demand in its local area, it could drive itself to another city where there is demand. And it knows where there's demand because this is all being done on the trade net, right? That's why we have this thing. And of course, if they really die, they could be salvaged. So the idea is their numbers fluctuate, and they grow and they shrink, and through market competition, they reach a kind of equilibrium where the services are being provided as cheaply as possible. Because although they can make a profit, there's no real requirement that they do. Right? That's a profit and loss is a symptom of mismatched supply and demand. Now, they have to be able to evolve. Because if they didn't, what would happen is that the infinitely smarter humans that are competing against them would innovate, and these programs can't innovate because they're just programs, right? We're not assuming any fantastical Star Trek technology here. And the humans would outcompete them with new services and more innovative business models, and they would all die. So what we need is the ability for them to evolve, and they can do that by hiring humans to write upgrades. The question is, how do they know that it's really an upgrade? One of the most common ways that agents can die is by having much smarter humans scam them out of their money, and then they've got no, got no money left and they die. This is, being scammed by humans is very easy if you're an agent because, let's say you buy a service from a human and it doesn't provide it. What is the program going to do? Is it going to sue the human in a court of law? Well, I don't think so. So you need alternatives to these things. So after it's hired a human to write an upgrade, what it does is it waits until it's able to have a child, and then it can give the child the upgrade, and if it's really better, then the child will outcompete the parent. Alternatively, if it's possible to program it this way, you can do A/B testing. Use this software for half of my taxi rides and this software for the other half, and see which half makes more money. So why would anyone ever allow such a crazy idea to actually happen, right? Why would we allow machines to outcompete humans at our own game? The obvious answer is that because they don't really have any costs beyond their input costs, like electricity, their services are really, really cheap. And because they can be programmed to, they don't necessarily want to have a lot of profit, their competition should drive profit margins really, really low. And that means that all kinds of services that we could have today but are just far too expensive suddenly become feasible. In the future, Jen is being driven around by her self-driving car. But what if one company obtained a monopoly on self-driving cars, right? Because it's a complicated technology, that's certainly possible. It's happened many times in the past. Then perhaps she wouldn't really be able to afford it because this monopolist would charge a large sum of money. But if you have a completely automated market, then this is not really possible. And that's the justification for their existence. So what other agents might there exist in 50 years? This is the MatterNet. It's a concept from MIT. Actually, I think it's a startup in the Valley. The MatterNet is investigating ways of using flying quadricopters to deliver objects. So the idea here is, hands up if you've seen a quadricopter. You know, if you've seen a video of one. Yeah, I guess a lot of you have. These are basically, very briefly, these are basically like flying machines that have 4 sets of helicopter blades, and they're very agile. There are videos on YouTube of these things being able to like balance poles, like a walrus might, for example. And because they're very small and they're very agile, they can navigate through urban spaces very effectively. So what this company is doing is saying, why don't we have a fleet of these things, and then they deliver objects like the internet delivers packets. So they can pick something up, they drop it at a rendezvous point, another one comes along, they pick it up, they drop it at the next rendezvous point, and so on, because they're only small, they only have short range, so they can't like fly 100 miles or anything like that. And they envision this as like a competitor to the Postal Service. Now, copters, you know, you can imagine again that, you know, 1 or 2 companies end up owning all of this infrastructure. It'd be quite easy for it to end up this way, so it could end up being very expensive. Let's say that these quadricopters are also agents, so they pay humans to repair them, to recharge them, and so on. They deliver objects, that's how they earn their money. Let's take a concrete example of when this might be useful. Right? Let's say that Jen is on a walk in the Scottish countryside on a hot day. Bear with me here, it's a story. And as she's walking, she realizes that she did something really dumb. She left her water at home, and she's really thirsty. Now, if today this happened, technically what you could do is you could actually phone someone up in the local town and say, hey, could you catch up with me and bring me an ice-cold Coke? And in theory, you know, you could find someone and pay them to do that, but in practice, no one ever does, even if this happens in a third world country, because, you know, the difficulty of finding such a person is very high, and the amount of money they would charge is very, very high as well. It would never make economic sense to do that. But with something like the MatterNet, you certainly could. You know, Jen could just say, I'm feeling thirsty, and her personal computer says, I know what that means, and it goes off and it hires one of these things to just fly along, bottle of Coke drops out of the sky, she starts drinking it. How amazing is that? That's exactly what she wants, and it's cheap, right? But it's not only inanimate objects that could be delivered. You know, what about delivering more agents? So imagine that there's a lot of people on this hot day, and they're down by a park, and they're all getting thirsty all at the same time. So they're all saying, I would love a bottle of Coke. And these bottles of Coke are just falling out of the sky, right? Because it's just really cheap, so they can do that. Perhaps an autonomous vending machine wakes up and it says, I see there's a lot of demand in this particular location. I know what people would really like. And it goes onto the trade net and it hires the quadricopters, and they come and pick up the vending machine and drop it into the middle of the park. And so what you have now is actually urban infrastructure that reconfigures itself around real-time demand on the market. These are pretty strange ideas, but you can see like the logical extrapolations we're following to go from one to the next, right? Flying vending machines, it's technically possible. I'm not saying it's actually going to happen, but it could do. Now we've got a fairly obvious economic starting problem here. The whole point of these things is that no one owns them because there's no intermediaries creaming money off the top, therefore who would ever make them, right? Why would anyone ever build such a thing if they're not actually going to make money out of it? And this is a very common problem in economics. We call this thing a public good, and it means that once created, no one really directly profits. The indirect profit is huge because now you can just get driven around by taxi all the time and things just appear out of the sky when you want them, which is great, but you know, there's no one directly profiting because there's no infrastructure provider that's intermediating all of this. It's a very Bitcoinish philosophy. So the first agents have to be developed via something called an assurance contract. Hands up if you've heard of Kickstarter. Hands up if you've heard of the term assurance contract before today. Yeah. So assurance contract is a term you'll never see used on their website. But it's what economists call the economic model that Kickstarter implements. So if you look in the economics literature, you'll see this funding model referred to as an assurance contract. Essentially, an entrepreneur says, I will deliver this public good for $10,000 if I receive that amount in pledges before a certain date. And then people come along and they say, I pledge $100, I pledge $500, and these people don't actually pay unless enough pledges are gathered to meet the target. And this is a very well-studied source of funding public goods. And it doesn't get used much today, as you can tell, because no one has ever heard of assurance contracts except for Kickstarter, because banks can't do it, credit cards can't do it, right? This is a kind of more complex financial transaction than a one-to-one payment. Bitcoin can do it, by the way. It's built into the protocol that you can actually build these sorts of transactions. We don't really use that capability today because the GUIs for it are lacking, so you have to be kind of a specialist to do that. It'll get fixed at some point, I'm sure. And so that in future, lightweight assurance contracts will be really common because it will cost you nothing to create them, and they can be done in a completely peer-to-peer manner. It's not like Kickstarter where they insist that you have you make videos for your project and all kinds of very heavyweight stuff. You could just do them whenever you want. And it's interesting because today a lot of public goods that we have are actually funded through taxation. But in future, there's no real technical reason why it would have to be done that way when you have a financial system that's flexible enough to implement assurance contracts directly. And if you go to Kickstarter, you'll see lots of examples of people making movies and music albums and hardware designs and all kinds of things using this funding model. So this is an obvious idea for how the first agents can be made. It's something that everyone would benefit from, but no one wants to benefit, or no one should be benefiting directly, so someone can offer their services effectively like a programming contract in a way. Now, this is a strange idea. I'm sure you haven't encountered the whole idea of agents before. So the first thing that I hear when people learn about this is, what are all the people going to do if they all get replaced by automated markets? And this is a very reasonable concern. And unfortunately, it's a fact that if you look over the long span of time, starting with the Luddites all the way up to today, the trend has been that if your job is mechanical and not creative, and there's no creative component to what you do, then you can be automated. And we've seen this with factory workers, right? That was a story of the 20th century being automated away. But people who worked in offices and wore suits, and they tended to feel very safe because they said, well, even if I just come in and I calculate the same spreadsheets every day and I send off a bunch of letters and I open some bank accounts or whatever, and I'm basically just doing a very repetitive sort of task. But I'm a middle-class professional, so I can't really be replaced by a robot. But that's not technically true. And in future, if the financial systems we use can support it, then these people will be automated away too. And so what we need is to recognize that computers have made enormous strides in doing all kinds of complicated tasks, but one thing no one has ever even made tiny amount of progress on is making a creative computer that can think for itself or be innovative or come up with new ideas. That's the competitive advantage that humans will apparently always have, barring some incredible breakthrough in computer science, which has never happened in 100 years. Never even got close, right? So what we need to do is shift people out of the model where they are sort of coming into an office every day and doing something that's basically just, the only reason they have their job is because banks don't interact with programs, they only interact with people. And there are, most people aren't completely like that, but there's a component of this to a lot of jobs. And these people need to start finding ways to really increase the creativity aspect of those jobs. This is, in the long run, I think this will all work out great. The pace of change is a concern, right? As is always the case with new technology. It's not so much the change itself that's a problem, but how fast it happens, and what the people who are displaced in the meantime do. I don't know anyone who's actually working on developing agents. It involves some fairly complicated programming and advanced security technologies to deal with this fact that humans can scam them and stuff like that, and all the infrastructure is missing, right? There's no such thing as a trade net today. But it is a theoretical possibility. So someone at some point will probably do it. And we need to start thinking about what that means now. But as I said, I'm fundamentally an optimist. And I think that if we don't give in to fear and ban these technologies before they even get off the ground, then one day we might be like this guy looking out at an amazing world of tomorrow with flying cars and all kinds of amazing things, just like I used to look at when I was a kid. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.